This talk was given by Roshi Martin, guiding teacher of the Endless Path Zendo, a lay Buddhist community in Rochester, New York. Join our practice, in person or online, at endlesspathzendo.org.
So today is Saturday, November 9th. And this is our first teisho 2024, our first teisho after the recent election. So to begin with, today's teisho will be a reading from Nelson Foster's Storehouse of Treasures, Nelson Foster Roshi, Recovering the Riches of Chan and Zen. Today's chapter will be on shame. So just to preface this, it's rather shameful to be an American at this point. People misused their own minds and the great freedoms of democracy. Now information is coming out that there are many people who voted for the present winner who are shocked to discover, that tariffs are going to cost them money, not lower prices, but raise them. Somehow, they just bought lies. They didn't use their critical intelligence to look past the lies. And many are shocked to discover that some of their undocumented relatives are actually going to get deported. They didn't realize it pertained to themselves. Shocked. This is rather shameful. As human beings have failed to use our intelligence to support the greatest good for the greatest number. Instead, we became quite selfish as a culture. We'll have to deal with that. It's not the first time it's happened. I don't know if you remember, if you're old enough or young enough to remember having been maybe 20 or so in the 60s, you felt exactly like this. The culture had no reference to wisdom and compassion. The Vietnam War was on. There was a tremendous amount of racism in the culture. This is when Zen first really opened its doors to actual practice in the West. That's how we began. The only difference is now maybe we've learned to be a bit steady in it. And that's what we can offer, a kind of steadiness. It's also not the first time it's happened in other places. I'd like to read two short things from William Butler Yeats, one of the greatest of the 20th century poets, who knew the troubles, the civil wars of Ireland all too well, and spoke from it. This is part 5 of his poem, 1919. Come, let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind, nor thought of the leveling wind. Come, let us mock at the wise, with all those calendars whereon they fixed old aching eyes. They never saw how seasons run, and now but gape at the sun. Come, let us mock at the good, that fancied goodness might be gay, and sick of solitude might proclaim a holiday. Wind shrieked, and where are they? Mock mockers after that would not lift a hand, maybe, to help good, wise or great, to bar that foul storm out, for we traffic in mockery. And this other, why should not old men be mad? Why should not old men be mad? Some have known a likely lad that had a sound fly fisher's wrist turn to a drunken journalist. A girl that knew all Dante once lived to bear children to a dunce. A Helen of social welfare dream climb on a wagonette to scream. Some think it is a matter of course that chance should starve good men and bad advance, that if their neighbors figured plain as though upon a lighted screen, no single story would they find of an unbroken happy mind, a finish worthy of the start. Young men know nothing of this sort. Observant old men know it well. And when they know what old books tell, and that no better can be had, know why an old man should be mad. So, the Storehouse of Treasures, shame. The Resource of Shame is Chapter 7. In the United States, shame's reputation, this is again now reading from Nelson Foster Roshi's book, shame's reputation has improved dramatically in recent years. Its sharp and sudden rise in public regard owes a lot to the prominence of a president who behaved shamelessly, and moreover put shameless behavior on display by speaking about it shamelessly as if it were something to be proud of. Shame had been trending downward in public discourse, condemned as a burden laid unjustly on people already struggling to hold their heads up, people overweight, in quotes, or badly educated, gay or transgender, out of work, formerly incarcerated, or merely poor. However well-founded that critique of shame was and remains, our shameless leader all of a sudden reminded many people that shame may, after all, have a valid and important place in our lives. I want to make a case here for shame as a constructive force, both in individuals and in a community or populace, and to point out that sense of shame in Chan and Zen as another of the tradition's treasures. Since the word is so loaded and the subject so rife with misunderstandings, I feel obligated to start by specifying what I mean by shame, and especially what I don't. Tops among things I don't mean is the social operation known as shaming, in which members of our prickly species take it upon themselves to attempt to inflict shame upon a person or group for saying or doing something that they, the shamers, consider worse than simply wrong, offensive, moral, unnatural, somehow an affront and danger to what they hold dear. While I can understand shaming as a protective reflex and feel empathy for anyone who succumbs to it, it brings no benefit except to the shamers, who may feel the temporary elation of self-righteousness. Otherwise, it generates animosity, fear reaction, and heightened polarization, the last thing we need. At any rate, it isn't my subject here. Secondly, I want to set aside the injurious form of shame I think of as imposed shame. Many people who've suffered abuse, especially in their childhood, experience shame of this sort, often for the rest of their lives. While their adult experiences of shame may seem internal because they aren't prompted by any overt criticism, indeed their abuse may not even be known to others, shame of this type truly belongs to somebody else. An innocent party is carrying a shame that the abuser has imposed, a residue of the original shameless conduct. A related form of shame, likewise distinct from the constructive shame that interests me, derives from widely held, often unconscious social norms rather than from personal abuse. When my father began getting unsteady on his feet, I gave him a pair of trekking poles, thinking he might be more likely to use them than the handcrafted cane he purchased but never took from its place behind the door. To my surprise, I almost had to beg him to try them out, and we hadn't gone far before he made clear the source of his reluctance. "Maybe if someone sees me," he said hopefully, "they'll think I'm doing this for exercise." By then, my dad had rounded 90, and I don't know anybody to have considered it a failing or in any way unbefitting that he needed a little help in walking about. But there it was. Through a sort of osmosis, he'd absorbed the prejudice against age, or at least against looking old, that has taken hold in many quarters. Such baseless, harmful prejudices grip us in many areas or arenas besides aging, unfortunately. I've already mentioned some that are now in the public eye. Others draw few headlines, if any. Teenagers with acne feel ashamed of their skin. People with hearing problems, young or old, often feel ashamed of wearing hearing aids. People who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own still feel ashamed to pay with food stamps at the grocery. People, especially girls and young women, feel ashamed if they can't meet the standards of body image projected in the popular media. These culturally imposed shames seem so baseless that they could be laughed out of existence, and I wish they would be. But again, that isn't my subject. As relational animals enmeshed in cultures interdependent, to put it in Buddhist terms, We can't claim to have any feelings that are purely individual in nature. Yet the type of shame I'm going to describe and praise is more personal than overtly social. It doesn't lead to shaming or result from being shamed, nor is it assumed out of private trauma or public prejudice. It arises out of a sense that one has acted, spoken, or perhaps merely entertained a thought in violation of some standard of uprightness that has become one's own. That's as far as I'm going to go toward defining shame for purposes of this discussion. Though sidestepping definition, I do want to address a distinction between shame and guilt that's considered real and reputable in some academic quarters. Scholars have gone so far as to group and compare societies using the rubrics guilt-based and shame-based, as if those terms were objective and neutral. Such comparisons, even when grounded in sociological data and phrased in sophisticated fashion, are predicated on distinctions implicit in the comparer's frames of reference. Under their construction, guilt is a product of private conscience and honorable as such, while they consider shame to be driven merely by social concerns, primarily by a fear of losing status in one's group. These attributions rest on two underlying premises, an inner-outer dichotomy and a concept of self that fits some society better than others and whose ultimate validity Chan and Zen have been questioning and undermining for more than a millennium. Unless we're satisfied to confine ourselves to preconceptions about shame, it seems to me, we need to explore it with reference to specific human contexts. So, some societies, including those that produced our tradition, have traditionally held shame up for admiration. Consider an assertion by the Japanese monk Ryokan, as dates 715-8 to 1831. And you know, he's really one of my favorite Zen personalities, one of the great poets, and really humble human being. So, famously good-natured Zen recluse and poet. And here's what he says about shame. A sense of shame is the greatest adornment. Shame is like an iron hook. It can restrain a person from misconduct. So one must always preserve a sense of shame and never lose it for even a moment. A person without shame is no different from a beast. When I chanced upon this statement 25 years into my own Zen training, it struck me as odd, verging on bizarre. I saw no connection between shame and the Dharma I'd come to know and appreciate. Shame, as I conceived it, was a form of emotional distress. Who could possibly make it beneficial rather than a klesa, defilement, a factor complicating our process of liberation? 20 more years of practice shifted my sense of shame unwittingly toward Ryokan's. Since shame has received scant discussion in American Zen circles, I don't know if many other long-term Western practitioners have arrived at a similarly altered appraisal of its meaning to our predecessors or its potential value now. Perhaps not, but however common or uncommon this constructive sense of shame may be, it clearly belongs to our heritage, and I see it as intelligible and valuable, whether or not one has devoted any time to Zen study. So, he goes on, the relevant contexts for the passage by Ryokan are nearly identical in Chinese culture. Mahayana Buddhism both taught a virtue of shame, and this flowed into Chan and into Zen from really Confucian society. And here's some quotes from Confucius. So let's look at shame as a positive thing. Noble people feel shame if their words surpass their actions. In other words, it's about a lack of integrity. We should feel ashamed if we say, oh, I'm, but don't uphold that in how we live. Of course, this is the real challenge of lay Zen in the West. Integrated practice. That realization isn't just for something on the mat or in the Doksan room. It's how we talk to the person at the post office, how we drive our car, how we buy our groceries, how how we deal with the problems of our culture. How are we whole and complete in being human beings? So noble people feel shame if their words surpass their actions. Smooth talks, flattering looks, excessive courtesy to be considered shameful. Concealing disdain and acting friendly towards someone is also considered shameful. In other words, if you're manipulating things in order to smooth your ways, simply, using smooth talk and flattering looks and excessive courtesy, and concealing how you really feel about something. Well, there might be times to do that, like you might need to do that to save your life. That's okay. You might need to do that to protect somebody else who's in danger. One of the challenges in the precepts is, Roshi Kapleau used to say, so if a Nazi came to your door and asked you you're harboring Jews, and you say, no, there's nobody here, that's a lie, technically. However, that would be the only way to uphold the precept of not lying, but to speak the truth. So, when the world sustains the Tao, this is an interesting one. This is Confucianism. When the world sustains the Tao, show up. When it doesn't, step back. When the Tao is sustained, to live in poverty and obscurity instead of serving the public good is shameful. When it's not sustained, to live in wealth and prominence is shameful. The people who put their money into a campaign that was anti-democratic, misogynist, and racist should feel shame, not pride in their wealth. This is going way back, and this is the roots of Zen. When it's not sustained, when the Tao is not sustained in the culture, to live in wealth and prominence is shameful. Then, a master said, when the nation keeps to the Tao, you receive a salary. If the nation abandons the Tao and you receive a salary, that's shameful. They're talking about government service. If you live in Nazi Germany, to be supported by the government and do your job is shameful. In your actions, have a sense of shame. If dispatched to the four quarters on a mission, don't disgrace your Lord's directives. Guide people with edicts, order them through laws, and they'll try to avoid punishment, but will have no shame. Guide people with virtue, order them through ritual, and they'll have shame and exercise restraint. Don't let familiar archaic elements in these statements obscure from you the evidence they offer of the beneficial function that shame has in Confucian doctrine. It probably understates the matter to say that shame serves as a pillar of Confucian ethics. Building upon this foundation that Confucian laid down, Mencius taught, one can't do without shame. The shame of lacking shame, that's shamelessness indeed. When you do something self-centered, what's wrong with feeling ashamed about it? When you hurt others through your own self-concern, what's wrong with feeling shame about it? Indeed, when I think of Aitken Roshi saying, not enough yet, not yet enough, this sense of shame about our own minuscule understanding of the Dharma. So easy to puff oneself up and say, oh, I'm working on koans, or oh, I'm practicing Zen. Shameful when you think of how minuscule our understanding is, how deep the way truly is, how far we all have to go, what beginners we all are. That's a wonderful kind of shame. It reminds you to keep going. Come on, man or woman, wake up. You only got like a smidgen. You got a speck of dust. You're calling it a big deal. Come on, get going. So, more explicitly, Confucius proclaimed, or Mencius went on after Confucius, shame is great for us. Cunning opportunists, get this, This was said, what? How far back does Confucianism go in China? 2,000, 3,000 years? Cunning opportunists have no use for shame. Does that sound familiar or what? Unashamed of being inhuman. What humanity do they have? Unashamed of being inhuman. What humanity do they have? All these pronouncements emphasize staying true to one another, not promising more than we can deliver, following through on what we do promise, and maintaining the respect of others as well as self-respect. Thus, they square with and buttress the virtue of Cheng, which is sincerity or integrity. We spoke about that in last week's reading. One of the Zen capping phrases makes the relationship crystal clear. A heart-mind that doesn't betray others. A face that won't wear the blush of shame. This is complete transparency. Being completely present, no self-centeredness, just the taste of this tea, just this person before us, just the feel of the wind on our skin. Where could there be shame in that? To be living completely honestly, sincerely, is to be living transparently. The same relationship underlies the shared etymology in English of sham and shame. Think of our politics in our country now and the degree of falseness, purposely used lies, presented by a sham. Sham has the same root as shame. Taking part in a sham, one incurs shame. The third classical Confucian text, Zhongyong, draws a connection between having a sense of shame and having the fortitude to act under difficult circumstances. Knowing shame, it says, is tantamount to courage. If you can see this is shameful, you have the courage to do something about it. This will be on our plate starting in January. Take it seriously. Practice is the foundation of understanding this deep, beneficial sense of being shamed by what's shameful and having the courage to continue on to be the most complete human being you can be. And this is doing something to benefit the culture and oneself. In the Confucian scheme of things, that is, instead of exerting repressive force, shame emboldens us to rise to the needs of an occasion and thus to live shamelessly in the very best sense of the word, doing something, maybe even thinking nothing shameworthy. In the support of this lofty paradigm of personal conduct, the Zhongyong cites the text of Chinese literature, the Book of Songs, which goes, a very ancient verse from the Book of Songs. Observed, living in your own home, be ashamed, even be unashamed, even in the most private corner. In other words, live in such a way that you have nothing to conceal, nothing to be ashamed of. This is a principled refusal to maintain a double standard, but it's also a way of freedom. So it's somewhat less than surprising that the indigenous Chinese orientation to shame aligned closely with the Mahayana teachings that arrived from India, that is, Indian Buddhism that came with Bodhidharma. So let's see. So in the Vimalakirti Sutra, just looking at basic mental factor of wholesome actions, shame turns up on various lists of what is considered to signal advancement on the Buddha way. So this is from the Vimalakirti Sutra and the description of bodhisattvas. Their form displays all the auspicious marks, every good feature adorns them. They are clothed in garments of shame and remorse, with a deeply searching mind their garland. And in the Lotus Sutra, shame separates those who will be able to receive Buddha's message of the single vehicle of Buddhahood from those who won't, which is when corrupt people in ages to come hear Buddhist teaching of the single vehicle, they'll be confused, will not believe or accept it, will reject the Dharma and fall into the ruinous paths. But when there are those with a sense of shame, people of purity, determined to seek the Buddha way, then for the sake of such people as these, you should widely extol the single vehicle, that is the Mahayana, in which in truth all beings already are on, maturing towards our original ground of wisdom and compassion, which we've hidden from ourselves through our habits of self-centered thinking. So let's see. When Chan and Zen gave shame a place, they typically treated the subject very much like, well, Confucian and Mahayana. See if I can find something that stands out here clearly. Basically, the point is, lacking shame, how can one avoid committing offenses? So this is a very Confucian and Mahayana precedent, and Zen teachers picked this up and saw it as an essential part of the culture they were transmitting, and that Zen grew out of. Evidence of such efficacy appears in the Precious Advice for the Chan Forest, which is a 12th century miscellany focusing on principles and practices of leadership in Chan communities. So a quote by the teacher, Master Guaoan Shanwu, on the trust that his disciples had in his teaching goes like this: my study of Tao is no greater than that of others. It is just that I have never done anything to be ashamed of in my heart. In other words, that's what engendered his students' trust in him. Not that his teaching was greater than anybody else's, but that he'd never done anything to be ashamed of. So he implies that excellence in Chan study practice doesn't in itself foster upright behavior. Other masters, past and present, might dispute that conclusion, but it surely deserves consideration in light of the ethical problems documented in Zen communities, both East and West, in recent decades. So he's also saying there's no guarantee here. We have to choose this. And if we don't, we should be able, grown up enough to feel a sense of shame about our failings, repent of it, and do better. This is the essence of the repentance vow, recognizing our own errors, feeling shame about them, and trying to do better. Better meaning be less self-centered, which means allow the world to step in when the self falls away. We become what we always have been, whole. To live from that wholeness is to live without shame. So the prominent master Da Wei regarded shame as a prerequisite for carrying Chan training to true fruition, that is, to really mature in Zen practice. Da Wei, who was one of the great teachers, of course, he was the one who burned the printing blocks for the Blue Cliff record because he felt people were getting caught up in its wonderful verses rather than seeing the foundation of transformation that Zen practice offered. They were getting caught up in the beauty of the verses of the Blue Cliff record, Hikigenroku. So he said, this matter, that is of maturing in practice, is extremely difficult, not easily completed. You have to generate shame to begin to attain it. Frequently, intelligent people with superior knowledge attain it without much effort, consequently engender mental laxity and fail to continue practicing. Many get wrapped up in visualizing past circumstances or grasping after the future and don't acquire any discipline. Ongoing practice really means carrying it through all the time. It's very difficult to do. And to really let go of whatever has been attained, to realize as Aiken Roshi used to admonish himself all the time, not enough yet, not yet enough, and to let it go and really commit again to this moment of practice. Not to cling to any sense of, I've got it. One of the major traps, there's a sense of shame to find I got caught by that again. Or I got lazy again. Or I thought I didn't have to practice every day again. No. If you really want to complete it, you have to maintain this. And a sense of shame is vital. It doesn't mean beating yourself up. That's not the shame we're talking about. It's not the shame of, what a shameful mess I am, and you kick yourself a few times. That wouldn't be it, but just the sense of integrity, of being sincere, of following through to your very best. That kind of transparency and honesty is really what it's talking about. So let's see. Xu Yun, many of you know that Xu Yun was one of the great masters of 20th century China. He lived to 120, like Chao-chou. There's a biography of his called Empty Cloud that myself, Freddie Epsteiner, Richard Wehrman, and Bob Schreiber were involved in publishing many, many years ago. And then it got taken over and published as a regular book, but we had permission from Charles Look, the translator, to bring out an early edition. Xu Yun was a remarkable 20th century teacher, like old school all the way, and again, lived to 120. So he wrote this: all of you come to ask me for guidance. This makes me feel ashamed. Everyone works so hard, splitting firewood, hoeing the fields, carrying soil, moving bricks. And yet from morning to night, you've not forgotten the thought of cultivating the way. Such determination for the path is touching. I, Xu Yun, am ashamed for my inadequacy on the way and my lack of virtue. Nelson will get into this. But the point here is, compared to the efforts of someone like, let's say, the Buddha, who was a young man at 29, left his home, went into the mountains alone, dealt with absolute terror. He'd never had this experience of being alone in the woods at night in the mountains. He was terrified. He kept going. He was so earnest in terms of wanting to find some solution to the issues of birth, old age, sickness and death, impermanence, that he starved himself thinking that might lead to it, until he was just skin and bones and came near death. And only then did he turn from that path to really discover, in a sense, Zazen, the middle way, and through that, realization. And think of all the ancients, the things that people did, men and women both. And we realize how lax, how feeble our own efforts are. Now, again, it doesn't mean you give up your family responsibilities, you quit your job, and you go sit in the forest. No, but it means to just have a sense of proportion. You say, I'm doing the best as I can right now, but try and make sure you are doing your best in terms of your own life. Just in terms of your own life, do your best. Be sincere. Don't fake it. And then Xu Yun compared himself to all the worthies of the past and honestly could say, he wasn't like trying to be humble. He was honestly saying, I'm ashamed of my inadequacy in guiding you. I'm doing the best I can. But compared to, I'm going to move out of the sunlight here so it's not quite in my face. Compared to those who've come before, my efforts, as complete as I can make them, are still pretty feeble, but I'll do the best I can to help you. And certainly, as a teacher, I feel that deeply. I'll do the best I can, but compared to those who came before, here I am. I'll do the best I can. Besides treating the topic in this expository manner so patently faithful to Confucian and Mahayana precedents, Chan occasionally engaged the issue in a snappy repartee that became a hallmark of the tradition. And this is from Chao-chou. Someone asked, what place do you accord an individual entirely without shame? We can think of such individuals today. What place do you accord an individual entirely without shame? Not among us, the master replied. The questioner persisted. How about if one suddenly appeared? Chao-chou said, throw him out. We tried to do that with the election. We try to do that every 4 years. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So, in a different context, the later master Wu Men, we know him from the Gateless Barrier, criticized Chao-chu's teacher. It must be said Nanchuan in his dotage didn't know shame. Cracking his stinky mouth, he revealed the family disgrace. Yeah. Discussion of shame consistent with the Confucian and Mahayana teachings continued as Chan took hold in Japan and morphed into Zen. As I've mentioned, jhana is meditation. In India, became Chan. Well, I'm probably not pronouncing it correctly, but it became that in China, which became Zen in Japan. It all really means jhana or meditation. So, here's from Shobogenzo Zuimonki, Dogen writing in now familiar language, urging members of his 13th century assembly to set their sights high. Even if one wants name and fame, rather than be well thought of by the inferior people of the present time, one should only have shame before the sages of antiquity and the good people of later ages. And even if one thinks of equaling someone rather than the people of Japan, we should be ashamed before the past masters and eminent monks of India and China and think of being equal to such as them. In other words, while it can be painful to have high standards, it's a good idea to have them. Compared to those high standards, one might find oneself rather meager. Well, that's painful, but it's really good to have high standards and to try and live up to the highest you can conceive of as what you can do in your practice. Do your best, knowing that people like you who are concerned about injustice, concerned about impermanence, in their own time did their best. And that's how this tradition will get passed on, by all of us trying to simply do our best and holding ourselves to high standards and being willing to feel ashamed if we fall from that and to pick ourselves up and try again. But not to go, oh, I don't have to feel ashamed about anything. Everything's just fine. I'm great. Well, in one sense, it's true. You're great. You're wonderful. Terrific. Bravo. On the other hand, we all have a long way to go. So let's see. Keizan Zenji, Dogen's successor 3 generations later, he rose to monastic leadership at the young age of 36, and he acknowledged he'd accepted his teaching duties prematurely and held himself accountable to both his predecessors in Soto lineage and his future descendants. And he wrote this, "Throughout the day, my conduct isn't good enough to serve as a sign for those who come after me. As I stand, sit, walk, and lie down, my attention is utterly unfocused. How can I face 3 or 5 monks and come up with a Dharma phrase, or even half of one? What a shame and disgrace! How fearsome, how dreadful to be like this under the scrutiny of the ancestors and founders, the invisible eyes of former sages." Yeah, the invisible eyes of former sages are looking at us. We have to feel a bit uneasy, don't we? Yeah. So this stayed in Rinzai training as well. Hakuin, the irrepressible, Nelson calls him 18th century master, raised the example of a common river porter. You can find this in Complete Poison Blossoms from a Thicket of Thorn, his wonderful compilation. talked about a river porter who eked out a living for himself and his family by literally renting out his back at a dangerous ford, carrying travelers through the raging current up on his shoulders. That's what people used to do for a living. Bridges weren't built at the time, so people got paid to carry people across the raging torrents. So here's the story. Finding a money pouch lost by a man who earlier had dickered with him over his fee and eventually chose to wade the river unassisted, the porter gives chase, catches up with the man, returns his money, and stoutly refuses a reward, saying he'd be ashamed to accept it. Quote, "If I act against what I feel to be right, my heart would never feel at ease." By the story's end, the porter's wife and aged father both have exhibited the same unshakable integrity, and Hakuin seems for once at a loss for words, closing his account with little more than a sigh of admiration. Still more recently, shame became a necessary topic as major Zen institutions in Japan responded to criticism for having provided tangible support to Japan's military of the 30s and 40s. So at a large anniversary commemoration in 1995, staged by Myoshinji branch of Rinzai Zen, its chief abbot raised a saying attributed to the celebrated 10th century master Wutsu Fayen. Wutsu is Goso. The buffalo passing through the window is a famous koan of his, which you might have enjoyed at some point. If not yet, I hope you will. It's a wonderful case. And anyway, I have practiced for 20 years. This is the quote. I have practiced for 20 years, and now I truly know shame. In other words, I now see how meager my understanding really is. It took me 20 years to get here, and the great blessing is I finally know shame, to see how incomplete my understanding has been. That suggests that his understanding is now very complete. But a sense of shame is the ticket by which he reveals that. It's very humble, isn't it? Rather than going, oh, now I've got it. He says, now I finally know shame. Where I've been at all these years. What a wonderful moment. What a humble way of expressing it. It brings tears to my eyes, really. What integrity. How shallow we all are. So Kono Roshi, the abbot who did the ceremony at Myoshinji branch in commemoration, at an anniversary commemoration, and he said this, the shame of which Wutsu speaks is not, of course, the shame of failing to understand the Dharma. It is the shame of realizing the Dharma. And yet, he adds a little bit to it, and I wonder if this is true or not. I think it's a statement of real understanding. But he says, and yet not being able to manifest it freely in the activity of one's everyday life. I think he was saying this because he was speaking about the failures of Zen tradition during World War II in Japan. And so he was finding this as a doorway to his own sense of shame for what Zen had done in supporting the government at that time. I don't think it's necessarily what Wutsu was saying, but it can be seen as a useful doorway into the issue at hand. So he goes on to say, Wutsu had come to awakening and attained peace of mind, yet had not fully integrated his experience into the everyday practice of the Buddha way. That same shortcoming, he then went on to suggest, amounted not only for Myoshinji's support of militarism during World War II, but also for its half-century-long failure to acknowledge its complicity, much less to atone for it. So he was using Wutsu's statement, which I think is much more complete than he's giving it credit for. And I think he had a reason to do that. So Nelson says we can applaud Kono Roshi for holding Myoshinji's feet to the fire and wag our heads sorrowfully about the extent of Zen teachers and institutions' participation in the war. But much more important now is considering whether we ourselves truly know shame. So Wutsu's statement implies an increasing sense here. Nelson's making this point, which is the one I agree with. Wutsu's statement implies an increasing sensitivity to shame as he continued his training. It's not that he grew less able to integrate his realization in daily practice, but rather grew more aware of his shortcomings. I suspect he might equally have said, I have practiced for 20 years, and now I truly know joy. That's the point. That at least is my experience, says Nelson, after 5 decades of Zen training. I can honestly say that I've come to truly know grief, gratitude, trust, satisfaction, love, and a host of other emotions, in addition to shame, emotions that earlier in my life I knew poorly, dimly, or unreliably, often only in retrospect. I'd place candid perception of our own thoughts. I'd place candid perception, get this, of our own thoughts and feelings among the many fringe benefits of Zen practice. I'd place candid perception of our own thoughts and feelings among the many fringe benefits of Zen practice. Having now claimed a true knowledge of shame, I can fairly be expected to describe it, to say how it feels, even while continuing to decline any attempt to define what it is. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. It's a rather long chapter, so I'll do my best to cut to the chase wherever possible. Shame, he thinks, he said, as a boy, I remember shame as a head-hanging misery. But of course, it begins with the realization that I screwed up. But now my regret doesn't lock me in or plunge me into despondency. On the contrary, the shame I feel now shows me something encouraging, the discrepancy between what I've done or not done and the more honorable way that I perhaps unconsciously but genuinely want to think, speak, and behave. So he sees that shame is encouraging now because he's recognizing there's something off about what he's really attempting to be as a human being. And so he finds that beneficial. When it operates this way, shame turns from burden to blessing. Recognition that you've erred becomes an indicator of which way your ethical compass actually points, lending shame an ennobling aspect. To feel it is honorable, a mark of good character, which is what our Buddhist predecessors had in mind in designating shame as an adornment. So he's now going to give a couple of quick examples of shame in ordinary life. I'll pick just 1 or 2 or 3. Playwright and performer Noel Coward from a letter. Do you remember the actor and playwright Noel Coward from the 40s? Very famous. He actually died doing anti-Nazi work. He gave up his Hollywood position, I believe, if I'm thinking of the same one, or that might have been. Anyway, he took a similar stance. He wrote, from a letter to his mother at the beginning of World War II, if I ran away and refused to have anything to do with the war and lived comfortably in Hollywood, as many of my actor friends have done, I should be ashamed to the end of my days. Quite a statement. He could have had a lavish life in Hollywood. He was very successful. He gave it up to do work that he felt was more important. And I believe he gave his life doing it. He said, but if I just lived comfortably in Hollywood and had nothing to do with the war, I would be ashamed to the end of my days. W.S. Merwin, who was a student of Aiken Roshi's for a while and won the Pulitzer Prize, the poet, when he received the Pulitzer, he declined it, explaining to the public, and this was during the Vietnam War, after years of the news from Southeast Asia and commentary from Washington, I am too conscious of being an American to accept public congratulation with good grace, or to welcome it except as an occasion for expressing openly a shame, which many Americans feel day after day, helplessly and in silence. So he used the opportunity to speak up and refused to receive the Pulitzer Prize in light of what America was doing in Southeast Asia. Interestingly, Frederick Douglass, who has roots in Rochester, during his enslavement as a boy, in urban circumstances, found that in urban circumstances, this is a quote from him, Frederick Douglass, there is a vestige of decency, a sense of shame that does much to curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so commonly enacted on the plantation. In other words, in urban settings, he found that people had a vestige of shame that prevented them from doing the really horrible things that without shame were done on the plantations in the South. Let's see. Scholar, critic, and activist David Shulman, reflecting in 2017 on Israeli society as he'd come to know it 50 years before, shame, sincere or not, had not yet disappeared from public life. Now, Israelis are in trouble in this regard. Bob Dylan put to music his feelings about the boxer Reuben Hurricane Carter being obviously framed and imprisoned for murder he didn't commit. And the line in the song Hurricane is, couldn't help but make me feel ashamed to live in a land where justice is a game. And finally, Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor takes the long view. Civilization is, in a sense, a matter of feeling shame in the appropriate places. Civilization is, in a sense, a matter of feeling shame in the appropriate places. So let's see if we can skip ahead a little bit more now. Shame is, in other words, he's saying, can be a corrective for past actions or an existing situation, and may function as an early warning system to prevent malfeasance. Notice a feeling or thought that you're ashamed of. Notice it. In your practice, you're more likely to notice it, not just suppress it or have it drift through and you don't notice it. Notice it, and it drastically reduces the likelihood that you'll actually do or say it. So if in your sitting you notice something that gives you a twinge of, you're less likely to do it in your life. So in many ways, Zazen, the shame we may experience in sitting is salvation itself. And it changes the world, prevents us from doing shameful things. This is the iron hook of restraint that Ryokan praised, and its use makes shame-free personal conduct at least conceivable. Robert Bringhurst, who's a very interesting scholar of languages and knew a lot of Northwest, could translate Haida and Tlingit, Northwest Coast languages, and their stories. His books are terrific. Passes on a proverb of the Haida people that shows that hook functioning at a very high level. This is a quote from the Haida people of Northwest Coast. In its simplest form, it is this: the ground might see me, or the earth might see me. If I do something shameful, the earth might see me. You could say in Haida, I won't do this or mustn't do that because the ground might see me. They might also say the beach sand would be able to see me. Now, think of the Buddha in the great legend of his enlightenment, when Mara is coming and saying, are you worthy of coming to enlightenment right now? He doesn't answer. You remember that? He touches the earth and lets the earth answer for him. And the earth responds with all the voices of trees and plants and stones, animals, rivers, seas, mountains, that there's not one spot on the globe where in some past existence he hasn't already offered his life fully to the welfare of all beings. Haida have the same feeling. The ground might see me if I did something shameful. Who are these people without any shame or causing so much harm. It's shameful. Bringers hammers home the point, commenting, if that's what you say and you mean what you say, if you practice integrity, in other words, the earth is more than just a place to go hunting and fishing and drilling for oil. It is a moral and ethical benchmark. A benchmark with eyes. Other people may be good ethical reference points as well, but the basic moral reference is the ground beneath our feet. Elias Kennedy, Bulgarian-born author and Nobel laureate for literature in 1981, spoke for me and surely many others in saying it is a mark of fundamental human decency to feel ashamed of living in the 20th century. He was referring to genocide, wars, atomic bombings, and the other sorrows of our lifetime, and would say the same thing, no doubt, of the 21st century if he'd lived to witness it. This is a sense of shame we can't truly avoid, it seems to me. We needn't minimize the accomplishments of our species or the upsides of modernity to acknowledge that we've also disgraced ourselves by the harm we've done. I truly know this is a shame that's mine through simple membership in the offending species, but unfortunately, it's also all of us to the degree that we participate willingly or even unwillingly in the mechanisms of destruction, even driving our cars to get groceries. We know we're adding to global problems. This is part of our difficulty of living in this 20th century. And people, I think, who vote in a certain way, were trying to avoid an unconscious sense of guilt about all of it, to just throw it aside as if you could. But to be honest, you can't. And Nelson said, it motivates me to minimize whatever participations I can as a way of responding to the ongoing griefs as creatively as I'm possible. So, as possible for me. One more thing, and then we'll close this. Chao-chou, one of the great Chan poets of all time, gets us to the point where he's saying, none of this means we have to stagger through our remaining years feeling horrible. Not if we truly know shame, truly realize the honor inherent in it, and truly do our best to live accordingly. So he goes, Chao-chou, one of the great Chan poets of all time, in 813, at the age of 41, was a rising government official and literary figure who had gone home to observe a customary 3-year period of mourning for his mother, when an exceptionally heavy snowfall prompted him to wonder how residents in the nearby village might be faring. In a poem written at the time, he noted that of 10 houses, 8 or 9 were poor, and imagined ill-clothed families around meager fires, huddled all night waiting for the dawn. He, on the other hand, was, quote, snug in a thatched hall, gate shut in woolens and furs, under silk coverlets, sitting, lying down, warmth overflowing. He ended the poem, thinking of those others, I'm filled with shame. Ask myself, what kind of man I am. Thinking of those others, I'm filled with shame. Ask myself, what kind of man I am. It's a good question, and those of us living in circumstances even more comfortable than his should surely ask it of ourselves. For him, the poem answers the kind of person who would write such a verse and make it public, the kind concerned for the welfare of people less well off than himself, the kind who knew shame. In short, an honorable person. It follows that his sense of shame didn't end with the blizzard or that poem. Returning to office the next year, he took it upon himself to criticize imperial policy toward the peasantry, and did so frankly and forcefully enough to draw a demotion and in 815 exile to the hinterlands. So finally again, Nelson points out, for me, shame peaks when I reflect on the injuries we've inflicted and continue to inflict in non-human contexts. As terribly as people sometimes treat one another, nothing seems worse to me than the damage we've wreaked on blameless life forms other than our own, and on the natural wonders generally seen as inanimate, mountains, rivers, forests, deserts, the glorious seas, the very skies. We can't retract all of this devastation, but some we can remediate, and it is never too late to bow in shame and to salvage a few shreds of dignity. Nor is it too late to decide to do less harm in the days and years ahead. So shame is an ennobling force in terms of true honor, and is the core of Zen tradition, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. To realize you've done wrong is the beginning of being able to do right. To be afraid to face that you've done wrong, critical race theory, all of that sense of, no, we won't teach that, is to be afraid of maturing, coming into your own as a human being. It takes courage. As Winston Churchill said in the mailing that we sent out recently, in face of the rising Nazi tide, when the Battle of Britain was yet to be, was about to become, he said something like, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." It is the courage to continue that counts. And what seems to me most shameful about this election is the cowardice expressed by so many, a willingness to save some money and a willingness to overthrow the human rights of a democratic society. It seems simply an act of cowardice. Of course, in many ways, that cowardice comes down to believing lies because it was easier to do so, rather than checking to see if there was any truth in what was being said. And now we all have a comeuppance, and we've got to remain with our honor and our courage to do our best. That's what's on our plate.